This is Math 6, Lesson 5-3, Fractions with Unlike Denominators. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to see if you have if you understand how to get things into the form that we need them today. We'll start with this first question, which simply asks, how can you describe the sum of 3 pennies and 2 nickels using a common name? You might think 3 pennies and 2 nickels. Well, what do they have in common? Well, they're change. And if I was talking about money and I'm talking about change, I would name it in dollars and cents as money, and these would be the cents part. So these are simply cents. So the common name here would be cents. How can you describe the sum of 2 pens and 2 pencils using a common name? If I wanted to talk about them, if I wanted to sound really sophisticated, I could call them writing implements. But that's kind of hard to understand with some people. So just call them like writing utensils, okay? Or things you write with. So writing utensils or writing implements. Okay. In the above questions, we found common unit names for a group of unlike objects. When we work with fractions with different or unlike denominators, we're going to do the same thing. To find the sum or the difference of 2 fractions with unlike denominators, we need to rename the fractions using the least common denominator, also known as the LCD. Then add or subtract and simplify. Now the LCD is just the LCM, the least common multiple, of the denominators of a fraction. That's why it's called the LCD. Okay, so this is where our least common multiple comes in yet again. We learned this last chapter, and it's coming back again this chapter. So, to add or subtract fractions with different denominators. The first thing you're going to do is find the least common denominator. Then rename both fractions using the least common denominator. Find your missing numerators to make your fractions equal. Add or subtract the fractions with a common denominator, and then simplify if necessary. I have an example here. 3/5 plus 3/5 plus 2/15. 5 and 15 are your denominators, but they are not common denominators. Okay. 5 and 15 do have something in common. If you found the least common denominator of these denominators, it would be 15. Which means to multiply 15, I would just keep it as 15. Okay, so 15 times 1 equals 15, so 2 times 1 equals 2. 5 times 3 equals 15, so 3 times 3 equals 9. So 3/5 can be rewritten as 9/15, and 2/15 doesn't need to be rewritten because it is written with the common denominator. So 9/15 plus 2/15 is 9 plus 2, which is 11/15. And 11/15 is in simplified form. You'll notice that I write these fractions with a horizontal fraction bar. That means a fraction bar that goes across like this. Do not write fractions. 9/15 looks much better like this than it does like this. Do not do the diagonal fraction bar. Okay? No mathematician does fractions with the diagonal fraction bar. No scientist does fractions with a diagonal fraction bar. No doctor does fractions with a diagonal fraction bar because they're very difficult to read and very hard to manipulate. So please use a horizontal fraction bar. Also, write your fractions like I have here, vertically. They go down the page like this. Don't go across the page so that you have a big long string of fractions because they're really hard to follow. Let's look at some problems here. We're going to add or subtract. Okay, first problem says 5/7 plus 1/14. Okay, 5/7 plus 1/14. Least common denominator here between 7 and 14 is 14. I know this. If you do not know this, you will have to do the least common multiple to find your least common denominator. The easiest thing to do when looking for a least common denominator is see if your bigger number is your least common denominator. Here I have 14. I know that 7 divides into 14 evenly, which means 14 is my least common denominator. Now that I know that, I'm just going to rewrite 1/14 down here as 1/14 because I don't need to change the denominator. Here, 7 has to go to 14ths. What do I have to do to get 7 to turn into 14ths? I have to multiply it by 2. If I do something to the denominator of the fraction, I need to do the exact same thing to the numerator of the fraction. Just like if you do something to one side of an equation, you have to do the same thing to the opposite side of the equation. To keep things balanced, we have to do the same thing to all parts to keep it equal. 5 times 2 is 10. I now have 10/14 plus 1/14. 10 plus 1 is 11, so I have 11/14. That is in simplified form, so I am done. Looking at number 2 here, I have 5/12 minus 1/3. I'm looking at this going, my largest number is 12. Does 3 divide evenly into 12? Yes, it does. That means my least common denominator is 12. Since my least common denominator is 12, I can leave 5/12 as 5/12. 1/3, I have to multiply 3 by 4 to get 12, so I have to multiply 1 by 4 to get 12, and I have 4/12. We are subtracting this time, so 5/12 minus 4/12, 5 minus 4 is 1/12. It takes a little bit more to do the fractions when your common denominator is not a like denominator. Looking at number 3, my largest number is 9. 6 does not divide into 9, so my least common denominator is not 9. So just start to think of numbers that both 9 and 6 divide into evenly. If you can't find the number, then you're going to have to do the least common multiple. I know that 9 times 2 is 18, and 6 divides into 18, so my least common denominator here is 18. So I know I'm going to have to change both fractions now. I know that 6 times 3 is 18, and so that means I have to multiply 1 by 3. So 6 times 3 is 18, 1 times 3 is 3. I also know that 9 times 2 is 18, and 5 times 2 is 10. So I now have 3/18 plus 10/18. 3 plus 10 is 13. I get 13/18. That's in lowest terms, so I am done. Common denominators. If you work with them often enough, you'll be able to find a common denominator without too much difficulty. Let's look at a word problem. In Ms. DeMarco's class, 3/5 of the students chose cheese as their favorite pizza topping. Pepperoni was chosen by 1/3 of the students. What fraction of the students chose either cheese or pepperoni? Since we're looking for which fraction chose one thing or the other thing, that means we're talking about them being combined. So we're talking about two things that are being combined here. So we can simply add these fractions together. So I can take 3/5 and I can add to this 1/3. Notice how I'm doing my fractions vertically. Please do not do 3/5 plus 1/3 and then try to give me something plus something and make a big long string. This is ugly, messy, and very hard to follow. Don't do it that way. Do it vertically. It's much neater, easier to follow, and you'll be less frustrating. So, least common denominator between 3 and 15. Well, let's see. I know that 3 is prime and 5 is prime, and since they're both prime, I can multiply the denominators together to get my least common denominator of 15. Because 3 times 5 is 15. Therefore, I know that if I multiply 5 times 3, I'll get 15, and 3 times 3 is 9. On the bottom fraction, 3 times 5 is 15, and 1 times 5 is 5. So I now have 9/15 plus 5/15. 9 plus 5 is 14, so 14/15 is my answer. But since this is a word problem, I must write it in a complete sentence. Okay, so I can write 14/15 of the students chose either cheese or pepperoni. 14/15 of the students chose either cheese or pepperoni. That's your answer, written in a nice complete sentence because this is a word problem. Let's take a look at another word problem. You have 2/3 of a yard of felt. You use a half a yard of the felt for a display. How much felt do you have left? I have a certain amount. I use some, which means I take some of it away. And I have some left, which means this is a subtraction problem. We are taking 2/3 and we are subtracting from that 1/2. The least common denominator between 2 and 3 is 6. So my least common denominator here is 6. I need to multiply 3 times 2 to get 6, so I need to multiply 2 times 2 to get 4. 2 times 3 is 6, so I need to multiply my numerator 1 times 3 to get 3. So I now have 4/6 minus 3/6. 4 minus 3 is 1, so I have 1/6 yard of felt left over. So that's what I need to write for my sentence. You have 1/6 yard of felt left. Fractions with unlike denominators are not difficult, they just have one more step to them. And you need to make sure that you can find your least common denominator. If you can't find it, use the least common multiple. You always want to find the least common denominator because then you don't have to simplify at the end.